Welcome back, APUSH students. Today is Chapter 34 of the American Pageant, titled America and World War II. If you don't know the American Pageant, it's fine because the content is still going to be the same. I'm going to be going over all the key terms and notes for this chapter that helped me get a 5, so I encourage you to take notes along as well. ABC 1 agreement, idea that Germany was the main threat. It was a wise alteration from angered American sentiment that Japan was the main enemy, even though Germany proved to be a bigger threat. America had a lot of outrage against Japan after Pearl Harbor, obviously. It proved to be a solid foundation that protected other democracies against European takeover, because always the main threat in World War II was Hitler and the Germans taking over, or I should say Hitler and the Nazis taking over Europe, and maybe even going to England and then threatening the power of the United States. Executive Order 9066, don't confuse that with Order 66, order of putting the Japanese in camps. It symbolized the Pearl Harbor hysteria that encapsulated the American government and bypassed any thought of justice or fairness. It was a harsh step back to all the ethnic assimilation progress that made World War II American culture so strong. The progressive era in the early 20th century helped a lot of diversity and inclusivity in the United States. A lot of progress on that. Not that it was ever, finished, because the civil rights movement hadn't happened yet or anything like that, but it had gotten a lot better in terms of race relations in the country, and this set it back a lot, and this was challenged by the people in the courts, and it was also held up. You'll see that later in the chapter, or maybe it's the next chapter, I don't know. But the whole Japanese internment event was a massive black mark on the United States. Korematsu versus US, actually, this is the case right here. Case that upheld Japanese concentration. It provided constitutional authority for Japanese concentration camps, which allowed the government to continue doing it. It set a wartime precedent that gave the government much power over human rights. Think back to Lincoln in the Civil War, where he used a lot of government power to take away rights of the people, especially criminal justice rights during the Civil War. This is a similar thing right here, where the court is granting the executive branch and just the government as a whole to restrict a lot of human rights during wartime. War Production board that oversaw booming wartime manufacturing. This organized committee helped to orchestrate the immense production that finally lifted the American economy out of the Great Depression. It also helped the military mobilize for the war quickly. A big unexpected or indirect consequence of World War II was just a booming production economy in the United States, which finally helped to lift them out of the Great Depression. Office of Price Administration organized price controls to bring down inflation. This was a sort of government arbitrary thing, kind of following that New Deal theme. It was made in response to the intense inflation due to high wartime production and low wartime demand. These price controls were not of sound economic policy due to its artificiality, but it worked in the moment. Price controls as a principle, now with modern economics, they're not really seen as a good thing to really institute ever. But they did help in the moment just to bring prices down so consumers could buy their goods. But artificial government caps on prices and the free market isn't always the best thing to resolve economic crisis. National War Labor Board put limits on wages. The wage ceilings angered labor unions who resorted to strikes and walkouts. During a time of needed employment and production, labor conflict was not what America needed. Businesses were really relying, and the country as a whole were relying on people being able to enter and go to the factories and produce these goods that are needed for war. And having labor conflicts and labor union issues is just not a good thing when you really need to ramp up production to support the war. Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act gave government authority to seize strike-torn businesses. It was in response to the threat of a loss of production that strikes created, and legalized striking against government-operated businesses. This is, again, the government cracking down on rights. In this particular instance, the labor union rights. It seemed like a major government overstep, but it was necessary wartime policy to ensure production ran smoothly. WACS, WAVES, or SPARS, organizations that aided women participation in the military. This bolstered the American military and nursing corps, which expanded upon the immense male force. Their non-combat duties were vital in the war efforts. Another unintended effect of World War II was increasing the involvement of women and the importance of women in society. This will also extend to African Americans, because they eventually fought in World War II towards the end, and that gave African Americans more recognition and heightened responsibilities and just being able to be seen on a national stage, which was really important for them. Bracero program brought Mexican immigrants to work in the U.S. It helped to popularize the employee market as the draft stole many men away to the war. The program was vital to keeping the agricultural economy running, where it lasted many years beyond the conclusion of the war. The Bracero program was responsible for bringing a lot of Latino Americans down to the South to work on farms and stuff and in factories during war, and their population eventually stayed down there. It's not like they left after the Bracero program, even though that's what it was kind of designed to do. So they stayed there and really grew the Latino population in the United States. Zoot Suit riots, violence between white servicemen and Mexican Americans. It showed the still ever-present racism in America despite the expansion of patriotism that commenced during the war. It was a negative fallout of much of the wartime demographic shifts that mixed many ethnicities and areas. So when desperate times come for desperate measures, a lot of people are fighting to get into these factory jobs. You get this unintentional mix of lots of ethnicities and cultures that didn't really mix at the time in the United States. It was still very segregated, and that creates violence, unfortunately. Sunbelt states in the old Confederacy. In order to finally bring up the old Confederate heartland into economic prosperity, the Sunbelt received a disproportionate advantage in federal wartime investment to become a large center of production and job creation. So the government put a lot of emphasis on getting production and factory jobs and other just economic things down into the South because they wanted to bring up the South again to rival the North. The Sunbelt becomes more of a major term and factor later on after the war because they really start to make an impact in the economy. Fair Employment Practices Commission instituted racial equality in employment. This was a response to a major push by blacks to leave oppression in the South and take up the wartime job offers. Many blacks felt they needed protections against segregated facilities. This is not only a labor union thing, but definitely a racial civil rights movement. Because so many African Americans and other minority races were entering into the workforce and combining with a lot of traditional white-dominated fields, I guess, they needed more protections to help them really integrate into these fields. Double V, Victory in War and Victory for Racial Equality. It was the idea adopted by African Americans to not only aid wartime production, but take advantage of their expanded role in employment to advance arguments for racial equality. So remember how women were really getting involved in the war and making their presence known. African Americans are doing the same thing, really trying to take advantage of the moment for their cause. Congress on Racial Equality, or CORE, organization pushing for direct racial equality. It was a new organization in response to the expansion of African Americans' importance and prosperity during wartime. This Congress committed itself to direct action, although nonviolent. This is where you start to see the modern civil rights movement really break out, and it obviously doesn't become a really big thing until Martin Luther King and into the 50s and the 60s, but this is where you start to see the signs shown. Tuskegee Airmen, Air Squadron of all African Americans. It symbolizes African Americans' importance and involvement in the war. Although it was a result of segregation, their triumphs in battle in North Africa were inspiring. So the reason why it was an all-black squadron is because there was segregation. They didn't want to mix whites and blacks together, and that is not a good thing, but it did really uplift black presence and black voices in America. It really showed how important African Americans were to the wartime efforts and how they helped to uplift America, and that just puts them in a better place when they start to fight for their civil rights in the 50s and 60s. Douglas MacArthur, commander of the United States Army. He commanded the resistance against Japan in the East. MacArthur led with great attitude and perseverance, but his army was defeated and many soldiers were left to be brutalized as POWs. MacArthur is kind of a symbol of how brutal the Japanese fighting sphere could be, even if you were a great commander and a great general and really fought with, great attitude, as it says. But a lot of him and his men were subjected to just bad ends, and that just is a symbol for how really brutal the Japanese sphere was during the war. Bataan Death March, path to prisoner of war camps. On this path, American POWs faced brutal atrocities that symbolize the overall brutality of World War II in the Pacific. These camps became the site of many war crimes that the Japanese committed during the war. Again, this is just explaining how brutal the Japanese sphere was for the war. A lot of people hear about the European fronts and how bad the warfare was in there, but Japan was just as bad and sometimes worse. Battle of Midway, battle between the US and Japanese Navy. It was a critical battle because if Japan took Midway, they could threaten Hawaii and their entire naval fleet. The US victory finally halted Japan's advance and saved Hawaii and Pearl Harbor from many more attacks. Japan's navy was decimated when the battle ended. If you're interested in war movies, there's a fantastic movie on the Battle of Midway. I think it's just called Midway, and it's really, really good. Leapfrogging strategy, U.S. strategy where they landed and captured small islands. This is also called island hopping. This quick and brutal strategy allowed the U.S. to surround Japan's more heavily fortified islands, where they could attack through the air. It was highly successful, and America could attack mainland Japan through air bombings and, of course, the atomic bomb. So as they continued to brutally take these islands, it got closer and closer to mainland Japan, really threatening them militarily. Unconditional surrender controversy, debate over whether the U.S. should demand total surrender. Critics felt that total surrender encouraged long-lasting fighting and discouraged anti-war groups and governments to take hold. This policy was the main reason for full-scale European reconstruction after the war, where much of the continent's organization was thrown off when governments dissolved. So instead of a brutal takeover of all of Europe and all the land that the Allies conquered when winning the war, they instead tried to reconstruct it, keep the governments and countries in place, but install better governments and better people to try and uplift the whole entire area out of poverty and turmoil. D-Day, day of the invasion into Nazi France. It was a major operation that involved almost all Allied countries. The attackers met heavy German resistance on French beaches that led to many casualties. The numerous desperate landings were successful and laid the groundwork for the eventual freeing of France from the Nazis. A brutal but triumphant day for the Allies in the war. Holocaust, German murder of 6 million Jews and other undesirables. The reason why this is so far down in this chapter is because after D-Day and after they invaded Europe and eventually Germany, this is where they start to discover what was happening. When American and Soviet troops entered Germany, they found all the evidence of the imprisoning and slaughter, and it shocked the world. The atrocities committed during the Holocaust can be compared to nothing seen in world history. VE Day, victory in Europe when Germany surrendered. It marked the end of the battles in Europe where Hitler and Germany were done. After this day, America could turn its attention to wiping out Japan. Harry Truman, president who took over after Roosevelt's death. So this is when FDR dies and a new administration finally comes in after Roosevelt's very long stint in the presidency. He made the executive and controversial decision to unleash the atomic bombs on Japan. He also took over the post-war reconstruction plans from America's perspective. Truman had to take over and make some of the most critical decisions in American history. Any Oppenheimer fans know this was a scene in the movie where Truman tells Oppenheimer that all the blame for the bomb is going to be put on him, which is true. Truman had to own this decision, and it was extremely brave but also extremely controversial, and there are a lot of opinions over whether Truman should have done this or not. Iwo Jima and Okinawa, small Japanese islands in the Pacific. These islands faced desperate and brutal offensives from the United States, making tough landings on their beaches. America faced many casualties and their navy was partially destroyed, but these landings were critical to ensuring Japan's final days. These are famous island hopping islands where the US took really brutal and long takeovers of these really small islands, getting closer and closer to Japan. These were some of the most heavily defended islands. Potsdam Conference, meeting between Truman and Stalin. The results of this conference sent a message to Japan that they must surrender or be destroyed, because if Japan stayed in the war and had Russia and the United States fighting on either side of them, it would have been total destruction. The message was clearly sent, but they received no response, which led to Japan's destruction. So yeah, they stayed in the war and let Russia and the United States go after them, mainly the United States, with, of course, everyone knows what happened there. Manhattan Project, development of the atomic bomb. It involved brilliant scientists who created the plan and led the development of atomic bombs. The bomb had a successful practice run in a secretive desert in Mexico and greenlit its use in Japan. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, sites of atomic bombings in Japan. These cities were centers of war production in Japan, and when the A-bomb completely decimated them, it led to Japan's surrender. That's why these two targets are chosen, because they were the centers of production for all the weaponry that Japan was using, a lot of their navy stuff and planes. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed in the scene of what would be one of the most controversial decisions in American history. VJ Day, victory in Japan. It ended the war on the Pacific Front and altogether ended World War II. It crowned the ending of the most brutal war the world has ever seen. World War II is now over. And that's a wrap. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next chapter, and goodbye.